If you like these videos, please check out my full course at www.lsat.totaltestprep.net with tons of clearly explained actual LSAT questions written by someone who's mastered test and helped others master it, and an evaluation period where you only pay if you want to continue.
Alright, so in this video we're going to cover the principal scenario question. So what is the principal scenario question? Okay, so we're going to cover what do the principal scenario questions ask for. So more specifically, what does it mean to identify the scenario for the principal? How do these questions appear in the test? And how do we approach these questions? Alright, so in terms of the basic information, principal scenario questions ask you for the scenario that the principle in the argument applies to. So these questions are essentially the reverse of the principle justify questions. You're going to start with a principle, and then you're going to find the argument that it applies to, or the argument that expresses that principle. Now, in a legal context, it's very common to evaluate whether a set of facts or an argument applies to a given legal principle. So that's the legal connection. Now, the principle might be explicit or it might be implicit. If it's explicit, then it will either be stated by itself or in the context of an argument. So you'll be given the principle either just as an isolated principle or an argument that calls upon that uses a principle. If it's implicit, then the paragraph is going to be an argument or scenario that doesn't directly connect to the premises, or rather that doesn't directly connect the premises and conclusion with a principle, and you'll have to figure out what it is. You'll have to figure out what the principle is, and then which answer choice is another argument that could use that same principle. The answer choices will, as I mentioned, will virtually always be arguments, although sometimes you'll simply find a scenario if it's just a illustration type principle, like we did with the principle illustrate questions. And the question will generally deal with one speaker, though there might be multiple speakers. If there are multiple speakers or multiple arguments, then the question will tell you where to focus. And you can think of the answer choices as additional information which can be taken to be true, because remember, these are relevance question types. Okay, so that's that in terms of the information. In terms of the basic approach, you need to have a clear understanding of the principle. So that's the fundamental thing. You're essentially doing the reverse of the principle justify questions. So what you're doing is you're taking a principle and seeing if it applies to an answer choice. Now, for the explicit principles, if the paragraph makes the principle explicit, then you need to be clear on the sufficient and necessary conditions of that principle. Same considerations applies when looking at the answer choices in the principle justify questions. So, if the principle is stated explicitly in the context of an argument, then just pay attention to the principle and don't worry about the surrounding argument, because that's additional information. But the basic point is, in terms of the same considerations, it's does the sufficient condition match up with the premises? Does the necessary condition match up with the conclusion? And also, go through the answer choices looking for the argument that the principle applies to. So you got to make sure that the sufficient condition and the necessary condition, as I mentioned, in the principle match up with the premises and the conclusion. For the incorrect choices, the premise or the conclusion won't match up. And once again, you want to be on the lookout for false negation and false reversals. So that's for ones where you have explicit principles. You're basically just doing the reverse. You're identifying the principle and then matching up with the premises and conclusion with the answer choices. For the implicit principles, it's a little bit different. So you want to identify the argument and you want to try and come up with a principle that connects the premises and the conclusion. So you want to describe the premises and conclusion in general terms and then express that in conditional form. So you'll have a principle to work with. You then go through the answer choices looking for the argument where the gap between the premises and conclusion is closed with that principle that you came up with. Now, you may have to revise your principle if you're left with a couple of choices, because you may have not captured quite the right ideas or been abstract enough or may have made some assumptions. But generally, this is how you're supposed to do it, in the sense of coming up with your own principle and then applying it to the answer choices. You want to analyze the similarities between the premises conclusion in the choice and those in the argument, and you're looking for differences to rule out the choice that you think is incorrect. If you're down to a couple of choices, the best way to do it is, as I just said, you're trying to see what the difference is between if there's a relevant difference between what you have in the argument above and what you have in your choice.